when you showed that card to your parents, they were like, what the heck is this stuff? Like, what are you guys playing on the playground all the time? Very yellow teeth and a greedy grin. I mean, people didn't care as much about Blue Eyes White Dragon because everybody had those from the starter deck Kaiba. So not everybody had an Exodia piece, and nobody had all 5 pieces. Hey, what's going on, folks? Welcome back to the Parkside Merchant channel. We're kicking off a new series of videos today. I'm going to be going through my top 10 favorite cards from each of the first 11 sets. That would be LOB all the way through Ancient Sanctuary. We're going to kick things off today with the LOB set. We'll go through the 10 cards right now. I just kind of ranked these in terms of the cards that, for me personally as a collector, and even as a player back in the day, a lot of my opinions on this stuff hasn't changed much since I was a kid in 2002, 2003. A lot of the cards that I liked back then are the same exact cards that I still like today. So just thought it would be kind of fun to go through each of the sets, talk through a couple of the cards that really stand out to me. They're not at all necessarily the best cards, the most playable cards, the most valuable cards in some cases. It's just the stuff that, for whatever reason, stands out in my mind as some of the coolest cards from each of the sets. So to start off here with LOB, our first card is Mammoth Graveyard. This is a common, I know. Not a lot to write home about here for most people, but this is a card that certainly stands out in my memory as old, vintage. I had a lot of these as a kid. I think some of them came from several of the starter decks. I think starter deck Yugioh had one of these in there too, so was a card that every kid on the playground had. This was like the common of the commons, if you will. Just a real popular, very basic card. And a cool kind of artwork, right? It's basically like the skeleton of a mammoth. And yeah, just a fun card. Certainly, like, when I think vintage Yu-Gi-Oh!, this is definitely one of the things that pops into my mind, among a lot of other cards. But this is certainly up there as one of the most memorable vintage era cards for me. And so that's why it makes the top 10 for me for the LOB set. Next up, we've got a copy here of the Man-Eater Bug. This is another funny one, right? It's just not necessarily a fantastic card, but it was one that you remembered as a kid. Just a funny artwork. It had sort of the green foil, which looks really nice on it, to be honest, I think. And it's just a fun, sort of an artifact of the vintage era. And it's just something that's really memorable, very clever artwork, whatever this thing is. I know it was used a lot in the series too, so just a fun card to have, and certainly a memorable one for me from the LOB set. Next up we have Hane Hayne, also known as Hane Hayne. Different people have different opinions about the pronunciation of the card. I personally think it's Hane Hayne, but it's a very funny artwork. Something that every kid remembered as when we were young. Like, this was a very memorable, weird thing. When you showed that card to your parents, they were like, what the heck is this stuff? Like, what are you guys playing on the playground all the time? This was just a weird artwork, very memorable for me. It almost looks like some kind of a face with like a scythe, right? Like the things that they use on the fields, but just like a funny artwork. Very funny looking card. It stands out in my memory as something that was just a very original and very memorable item from the LOB set. So that's why this one makes the top 10. Okay, number 7, we've got a magic card here, Monster Reborn. This is one of those things that everybody remembers. I mean, this is about as OG as it gets when it comes to magic cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! The artwork is very attractive, a very unusual, sort of interesting imagery, a very shiny image. Just a fun thing I remember as a kid to look at, and a card that got used a lot in the series, so it had that connectivity with it. And it was actually a pretty good card. You know, it's kind of a staple, sort of a magic card to have back in the really old days. This was not a bad thing to have in your deck. So overall, cool card. Definitely makes my top 10 for a lot of the vintage magic cards for sure, and definitely for our LOB box here. So Next up, we've got another magic card, Rygeki. Can't forget this one either, right? This happened to be a very playable, very powerful card in the really vintage era. We're talking like back on the playground in 2002, 2003. If you were packing a couple of these, even one of them, that was a pretty big deal. These were pretty good cards. So, yeah, just a really fun, simple artwork, very shiny, had a very cool appearance to it. And it was just a good card. And it was also used a lot. I think Joey used this a bunch in the series, so it was the kind of thing you remembered. Got airtime in the show. It was good on the playground. Had a lot going for it, and it was pretty rare too. It was a hard find. So for all those reasons, it makes the top 10 for me for LOB. Next up, I know for a lot of people, they don't really care much about this because it was printed a lot. It was also part of Starter Deck Yugi, so there were a lot of copies of this thing floating around that people could use, but this is another one that for me, when I think vintage Yu-Gi-Oh, this comes to mind for sure, especially this version of it because it had that nice, almost sort of a flame-like shimmer to it in the background with that orangish foil on the back. Just a really good-looking card, very memorable. Yugi used this a lot in the series. And it was just a staple from the vintage era, just a very common artifact of vintage Yu-Gi-Oh! Next up, we've got Pot of Greed. I don't think it's a surprise that this made my top 5, but this is a card that you remembered as a kid. It was a good card. It was a funny looking card. It was like a meme almost. Before memes were like a thing, this was a meme card. Just an ugly, dirty face with like very yellow teeth and a greedy grin. I mean, when you were kids, this was like a fun thing to have. It was just a cool card. The fact that it was actually somewhat useful to have in your deck, and that it was just a fun, iconic artwork that got a lot of use in the series, just made a perfect recipe for something every kid wanted to have. And still to this day, Pot of Greed is a very famous, pretty expensive card for people that get this thing slabbed in like a 10 or a 9. All right, we're about to come up to the top 3 here. So the first in my top 3 is Exodia the Forbidden One. And I put the head here because that's the card that I think is the most representative of this set of cards, the 5 pieces. But when you think about this card and what it meant in vintage Yu-Gi-Oh, back in 2002, and even like 2003, 2004, like people, especially kids, didn't buy stuff online a lot. So if there were people on the playground that had even a couple of Exodia parts, right, that was a big deal. It wasn't like people just went online and like bought up a whole bunch of parts and pieces of stuff. And it wasn't like kids were often given the opportunity to just like walk the halls at card stores and gobble up really expensive items. So this thing, like, I know people say that the Blue Eyes White Dragon from LOB is the chase card and the holy grail of Yu-Gi-Oh! But in my opinion, like, and at least for the playgrounds that I played on and the kids I played with, like, if you were packing Exodia and you had all 5 pieces, nobody had that, first of all. It was unprecedented. Nobody had all 5 pieces at all in my social circles as a kid. So this was like an impossible thing to achieve. And the head, in my opinion, is like, it's the banner card of the 5 pieces. But Exodia is a big deal in Yu-Gi-Oh! And it's just like, yeah, I mean, the LOB Blue Eyes is the chase card from LOB that everybody remembers. But Exodia is, in my opinion, just as important and maybe even more important. Like where I grew up, people didn't care as much about Blue Eyes White Dragon because everybody had those from the starter deck Kaiba. So not everybody had an Exodia piece, and nobody had all 5 pieces. So sure, today you can buy up all 5 if you want on the web, but like back then, you couldn't get all 5 pieces unless you literally broke open dozens and dozens and dozens, probably hundreds of packs. And nobody did that because we were all kids. Nobody was able to buy hundreds of packs. So, yeah, to me, this is like definitely top 3 for the most favorite cards from LOB. Okay, number 2. This one might be a bit of a surprise to folks. Reaper of the Cards. So for me, this is definitely up there in the top 3. This card, not only was it kind of playable and gimmicky because of the stats, it had sort of a funny defense value there, as you could see, the 1930. It was just like a funky, gimmicky sort of a thing to have. It was kind of just a cool thing to have as a kid. I think during the series, right, it was used, I think, once or twice during the Duelist Kingdom saga before they got up to Pegasus. I remember it from the Bakura narrative where they were in the Shadow Realm. This thing hunted down like a whole bunch of the goons that worked for Pegasus. And then I think one of the Eliminators that Yugi played against used this card as well as part of his deck. So it got some airtime in the series. It's never really been printed a bunch, I don't think, since then, maybe once or twice. And it's got like a fun angle, right? It's Reaper of the Cards. It's sort of a self-acknowledgement that Yu-Gi-Oh! Is a card game. And this monster is the Reaper of the Cards. So to me, it's sort of like a very special monster in the Yu-Gi-Oh! Franchise because it's self-aware that the game is a card game and it gives lip service to the card notion in the title of the actual monster here. And it's just cool. Like, it's a very creepy, spooky monster and something that I remember very distinctly from the LOB set. So this made my top 3 easy. And now, obviously, number 1, you gotta have the Blue Eyes White Dragon. And I actually am not quite as averse to this card as some people. I know a lot of folks really don't like the artwork on it. And I actually did always kind of like this artwork as a kid. I always had several of the starter deck Kaiba editions of the Blue Eyes, which I thought it does look nicer than this one. I will admit that's a better artwork in my opinion. But this one I always also liked having. It was a different take. I know people joke about the giraffe neck and it's an ugly artwork and it looks silly. I still think it looks pretty formidable. It looks very dragon-like and very, very formal and respectable as a artwork. Do I like the other one better? Yeah, of course I do. Everybody, I think, pretty much likes the starter deck Kaiba version or the DDS version better in terms of overall aesthetics. But this also looked good, and it was a good card from the LOB box, right? It's the cover card from the box. And I think everybody that had LOB cards back in the day always wanted to have this. So I think it's clearly the number 1 card for me, even in hindsight. This is the chase card, obviously, from the set. So not a shocker, I think, that it's up here at number 1, but for me, it's justifiable. It was artwork that I liked as a kid. It was a fun card to have, obviously, to have a lot of blue eyes, especially later on. If you wanted to summon the Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon, you needed to have a lot of copies of this card. And even better if you could have a nice mix of the starter deck version editions and some of these LOB ones as well. So that's all here for today's video, folks. Just wanted to give you the rundown of my ranking of the top 10 cards from the LOB set. Let me know what you think in the comments. What cards did I miss? Which ones would you have ordered differently? And what do you think? So thanks again, folks. Appreciate the time as always. This is the Parkside Merchant Channel, and we'll see you next time.